From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana, Siddiqui. First, the headlines. Texas could vote to secede from the U.S. in 2023 as GOP pushes for referendum. Study reveals the harm of overwhelming negative portrayal of Muslims in media. 600 trains cancelled in India as 8 trains burnt down. Palestinians call for ban on concert in historic Negev Mosque. Photo exhibit highlights plight of Rohingya in Bangladesh. Fatima Payman becomes first hijab-wearing Muslim woman in Australian Parliament. Our top story tonight. Texas Republicans are pushing for a referendum asking voters to decide whether the state should secede from the U.S. The demand for a vote on the issue in 2023 was among many measures adopted in the Texas GOP's platform after last week's state convention in Houston. The platform states, pursuant to Article 1, Section 1 of the Texas Constitution, the federal government has impaired our right of local self-government. The party said federally mandated legislation that infringes upon the 10th Amendment rights of Texas should be ignored, opposed, refused, and nullified. Texas Republicans want the state legislature to pass a bill in its next session requiring the referendum in 2023. A detailed analysis is coming up later tonight in our show, so keep watching Muslim News. Muslims have not seen the same respect as other religious groups in the news and entertainment media for decades, according to researchers. Eric Bleich and A. Moritz van der Veen analyzed more than 1.5 million articles between 1996 and 2016 from the U.S., Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. The articles featuring Muslims were added to a database for analysis of their tone compared to articles about other religious groups. They were reviewed for negative language and themes about Islam compared to news about Catholics, Jews, and Hindus. The research found 80% of articles featuring Muslims contained negative framing compared to 50% for other groups. Former President Donald Trump pressing Georgia's Republican Secretary of State in January 2021 to find 11,780 votes should be enough to indict him. That's according to a former Watergate prosecutor who spoke with MSNBC on Sunday. Georgian officials are investigating allegations Trump attempted to interfere with the outcome of the 2020 presidential election in that state. Trump has dismissed the Fulton County investigation and the January 6 committee hearings as witch hunts. Former Watergate prosecutor Nick Ackerman said the Georgia case could send Donald Trump to prison. Trump's defense of his call to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger was to somehow pick up on some ambiguity in the tape, Ackerman said. The call in the context of the January 6 committee probe creates a case beyond a reasonable doubt, Ackerman said. Monday was World Refugee Day, honoring those forced to flee their homelands and rebuild their lives in new countries. The global number of refugees has surpassed 100 million for the first time on record. That mass migration is propelled by the war in Ukraine and other conflicts, the United Nations reports. The United States this year admitted less than 2,000 people in May. The U.S. is on track to resettle fewer than 20,000 refugees in fiscal year 2022, a fraction of the 125,000 ceiling set by President Joe Biden. Immigration experts question why the U.S. government is creating new, crisis-driven welcome program rather than rebuilding the existing refugee program. The U.S. should enforce a new law preventing imports from China linked to forced labor by Uyghurs and other persecuted groups, Human Rights Watch said. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act went into effect today. It gives U.S. authorities increased powers to block the import of goods linked to forced labor in China. Since 2017, Chinese authorities have detained roughly 1 million Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in the northwest Xinjiang region. Detainees have also been subjected to forced labor inside and outside Xinjiang, according to rights groups. The new law presumes goods made entirely or in part in Xinjiang or produced by entities in China linked to forced labor are not eligible to be imported. Cervical cancer is a preventable disease with appropriate screening tests. Yet religious and cultural factors can lead some women to forego screening. Particularly Muslim women have been found to be more likely to have a late presentation of female cancers due to cultural factors. Human papillomavirus self-sampling may provide a culturally sensitive alternative, but its acceptance among Muslim women has not yet been examined. Studies have shown the positive aspects of HPV self-sampling include privacy and modesty, convenience, increased comfort, and decreased pain among Muslim women. The negative aspects include religious taboo, low self-confidence in administering the test, and the perceived cost. Fatima Payman becomes the first hijab-wearing Muslim in Australian Parliament. Details after this short break, so stay tuned, and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Mr. Speaker, if I decide to wear a turban, or you decide to wear a cross, or he decides to wear a kippah or a skull cap, or she decides to wear a hijab or a burqa, does that mean that it is open season for right honourable members of this House to make derogatory and divisive remarks about our appearance? For those of us who from a young age have had to endure and face up to being called names such as Towelhead or Taliban, or coming from Bongo land, we can appreciate full well the hurt and pain felt by already vulnerable Muslim women when they are described as looking like bank robbers and letterboxes. So rather than hide behind sham and whitewash investigations, when will the Prime Minister finally apologise for his derogatory and racist remarks? Racist remarks, Mr. Speaker, which have led to a spike in hate crime. And given the increasing prevalence of such incidents within his party, when will the Prime Minister finally order an inquiry into Islamophobia within the Conservative Party, something which he and his Chancellor promised on national television?
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Assalamu alaikum! Open up your eyes.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, it's your brother Zain Bika from South Africa. One of the first educational programs ever produced for Muslim children was the ever-popular Adam's World series. The colorful and comical Muslim puppets stole the heart of a generation. Sound Vision will be releasing brand new episodes of Adam's World with the launch of a Adam's World app. Subscribers will enjoy new Adam's World episodes as they are released, as well as all the classic episodes of Adam's World. So visit adamsworldapp.com now to learn more, subscribe and enjoy new adventures of Adam and his friends. And let's keep helping tomorrow's Muslims today. Assalamu alaikum.
It's Adam's World. Believe me, there's a lot to see. Bismillah. Let's explore.
To stop this genocide, we need your help.
Welcome back. Fatima Payman won Western Australia's 6th and final Senate seat, becoming the first Afghan, Australian and hijab-wearing Muslim woman in Parliament. A former refugee, Payman's victory came on World Refugee Day. She is the state's only new Labour senator. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was quick to congratulate Payman on Twitter. Payman arrived in Australia as a child with her parents and 3 siblings. She grew up in Perth's northern suburbs, where her father worked as a kitchen hand, security guard and taxi driver. Her mother was a homemaker before starting her own small business providing driving lessons. Payman became an organizer for the United Workers' Union. On Monday, the UN Refugee Agency and the Liberation War Museum of Bangladesh jointly organized a photo exhibit highlighting the plight of Rohingya refugees. The We Are Rohingya exhibition in Bangladesh's capital Dhaka presented the work of 10 Rohingya refugees who had photographed people living in the Cox's Bazar camps. Cox's Bazar is the world's largest refugee settlement and home to more than 1.2 million displaced Rohingya Muslims. A majority of those refugees fled a brutal military crackdown in Burma's Rakhine state in August 2017. The display included 50 photographs capturing the culture, identity, hopes, and dreams of the persecuted people. More than 50% of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh are children under 18, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Heavy security has been deployed at most railway stations across India in the wake of violent protests by unemployed youth. Train services have been one of the worst hit in several parts of the country over the past few days due to protests. Some vandals even torched trains and damaged railways' properties in several places, especially in Bihar, leading to hundreds of arrests. Since protests began, several trains or their compartments have been torched in Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and Telangana, among others. Station masters' offices were also ransacked by protesters, and parked police vehicles were either destroyed or burnt. One person was killed in alleged police firing during one such protest in Telangana's Secunderabad. Unemployed youth have been protesting the government's scheme to recruit temporary soldiers for a 4-year period. Tunisian judges have extended an ongoing strike for a third week in protest of the firing of colleagues by President Kais Saied. Murad Al-Masoudi, head of the Association of Young Judges, warned of further escalations if their demands were not heeded. Judges will also stage a day of anger next week to express rejection of Said's policies, Al-Masoudi told Andalu agency. On June 1st, the Tunisian president sacked 57 judges, citing corruption and covering up terrorist cases. The accusations were vehemently rejected by the judges. Tunisia has been in the throes of a deep political crisis since Said ousted the government, suspended parliament, and assumed executive authority last July. Said later dissolved the suspended parliament. Pakistan is facing an influx of asylum seekers from neighboring Afghanistan. The latest wave stems from the Taliban's takeover of Kabul, according to the UN's refugee agency. Qaisar Khan Afridi, spokesperson for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in Pakistan, said more than 250,000 Afghans have been seeking asylum in Pakistan since January 2021. The overall number of Afghans with international protection needs is likely to be higher, Afridi said. Hundreds of thousands of Afghans fled to Pakistan and Iran since the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban last August. Many left the country even before the capture of Kabul, fearing backlash from the hardline group. Others emigrated to the U.S. or Europe. The Higher Steering Committee of the Arabs of the Negev denounced the Beersheba municipality's decision to hold a concert in the city's Great Mosque. The mosque was built more than 100 years ago by the Ottomans as a place of worship and a resting station for merchants. After the 1948 Nakba, when Beersheba fell to Israeli control, the mosque was used as a prison by the Zionists and then as a public museum, the committee said. In 2002, the Beersheba municipality sought to hold a liquor festival in the mosque's courtyards with more than 30 wine producers. It led to protests by local residents, and the festival was subsequently cancelled. In 2011, the Beersheba municipality proposed to transform the mosque into a special museum for the culture of Islam and Eastern peoples. Indian Americans in Texas and California protested last weekend against rising persecution of Muslims in India under the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party. Renowned American Muslim scholar Sheikh Omar Suleiman led the protest in Dallas. It was jointly organized by the Indian American Muslim Council and North Texas Peace Advocates. Sheikh Alauddin al-Bakri of the Islamic Society of North America led the Bay Area protest organized by IAMC, which drew more than 500 protesters. Suleiman called Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi a wannabe Hitler. He highlighted connections between the extremist Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the ideological parent of Modi's BJP, and Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party. Both espoused and promoted a hateful and shameless ideology, he said. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned, and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Mr. Speaker, if I decide to wear a turban, or you decide to wear a cross, or he decides to wear a kippah or a skull cap, or she decides to wear a hijab or a burqa, does that mean that it is open season for right honourable members of this House to make derogatory and divisive remarks about our appearance? For those of us who from a young age have had to endure and face up to being called names such as Towelhead or Taliban or coming from Bongo land, we can appreciate full well the hurt and pain felt by already vulnerable Muslim women when they are described as looking like bank robbers and letterboxes. So rather than hide behind sham and whitewash investigations, when will the Prime Minister finally apologise for his derogatory and racist remarks, which... Racist remarks, Mr. Speaker, which have led to a spike in hate crime. And given the increasing prevalence of such incidents within his party, when will the Prime Minister finally order an inquiry into Islamophobia within the Conservative Party, something which he and his Chancellor promised on national television?
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
We are Justice for All. Headquartered in the heart of downtown Chicago, Justice for All is a global humanitarian initiative dedicated to raising awareness for human rights concerns impacting vulnerable minority groups. Our diverse team of staff and volunteers, led by Imam Malik Mujahid, work tirelessly to help Justice for All achieve their goals. We promote policies that protect religious freedom, address the root causes of mass displacement, and recognize the plight of refugees and forced migrants. Together, we can continue to stand up for justice. Justice for all.
Welcome back. To discuss the Texas GOP referendum to decide whether the state should secede from the U.S., let's go to Samia Sayed.
Thank you, Samana. Texas Republicans are pushing for a referendum asking voters to decide whether the state should secede from the United States. Now, this is based on a claim that the federal government impaired the right to local self-government. But what does that impairment look like, and how likely is this demand going to be picked up? To discuss this in more detail is Dr. Joshua Blank, the research director for the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome to Muslim Network TV, Dr. Blank. It's a pleasure to have you join us today.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Blank, where is such a demand for Texas to secede coming from?
Antipathy towards the federal government is really a long-standing feature of Texas politics. It's something of a set piece, really, in sort of the politics of the state, but it's primarily, if not almost completely, driven by the state's Republican voters, and not even really a majority of the Republican voters, but really an activated and loud minority who have the ability to, if not, regularly, pretty consistently raise this issue, especially around the time of the Republican Party platform writing.
Now, the proposal refers to an infringement of the 10th Amendment rights of Texas. What is this infringement they refer to?
Well, it could be so many things, I think, based on those calling for calling for the secession of Texas. And for those of you who aren't aware, the 10th Amendment provides all of the rights not given to the federal government in the U.S. Constitution to state governments. And it's a longstanding claim of Republicans and Texas Republicans in particular that the federal government has overstepped its bounds, and in doing so, has trampled on the rights of the states to govern themselves.
From what I recall, this is definitely not the first time that Texas has made such an effort for independence. What are some of the events or efforts that have preceded this one?
Efforts to secede from the Union, or at least efforts to even have the conversation, occur most often when there's a Democrat in the White House, and in particular when Democrats have control, either nominally or in reality, over the federal government. While antipathy towards the federal government does not go away when Republicans are in charge of the White House or the government, and in fact, polling that we've conducted at the end of the Trump presidency still found a majority of Republican voters in Texas disapproving of the job the federal government was doing. But what you find is with a Democrat in control of the White House, Democrats in control of the House of Representatives here in the United States, and also nominally in control of the U.S. Senate, this is when these sorts of conversations really pick up. But they don't go away just because a Republican or Republicans take over the federal government.
Right now, the proposal is being played in the media as almost an implausible one that has no legal precedence or foundation. So what is the purpose of this proposal then?
The legality of these proposals is not really a concern or consideration of those writing the party platform. Ultimately, we know that the state can't legally secede from the Union because we had something called the Civil War, which showed where the path of that would go. But also, that's not really practical for the state. Ultimately, Texas receives a lot of resources from the federal government, and it would be very difficult for the state to just replace those and declare itself a new nation. So ultimately, these kinds of proposals are a little bit more fantasy than they are reality.
If these proposals are more of a fantasy than a reality, why is it that they keep coming up every few years?
In Texas, where we have had one party rule for the better part of 2 decades with Republicans in control, ultimately what you find is that the biggest competition in the state occurs in Republican primary elections, where Republicans are running against other Republicans. What this means in most cases is that if there's an activated constituency of Republican voters, even if they're a minority of Republican voters clamoring for some kind of policy, it's not really a heavy lift to get that policy included in the Republican Party of Texas's platform, because ultimately the platform doesn't necessarily really control the agenda of state government. It just is as a statement of priorities from some of the state's most conservative and most activated voters. But it's not necessarily the case that come legislating time next year, we're going to see a lot of effort or a number of proposals to remove Texas from the United States.
As you've said before, this has come up multiple times over the years. How has it changed or even shifted from how a similar proposal looked like from last year?
I don't think it's changed terribly because ultimately it's not a terribly realistic proposal. The details are somewhat irrelevant when something is has such a long shot of actually occurring. The state has a number of serious and real problems that it's trying to face, as does the country. And the type of legislative effort and the overall reaction to it would be the sort of thing that would make it very unlikely that anyone would spend very much time really seriously considering this proposal.
And what are some of those problems that you think should be worked on or discussed?
Well, the most obvious problem is that it's not legal for Texas to secede from the United States, and would automatically create a conflict with one of the most powerful nations in the world. But secondarily, Texas receives so many resources from the federal government in terms of transportation dollars, in terms of education dollars, in terms of securing the border. One of the biggest issues in Texas, especially for Republicans, is border security and immigration. And given that Texas has a 1,200-mile border with Mexico, the responsibility for securing that, as much as Texas and especially Texas Republicans complain about the federal government's lack of responsibility in taking care of securing the border, if that were to fall to Texas, it would literally eat up almost the entirety of Texas's budget and be the only thing that the state could really take on seriously.
Now, I know you said that there's only a minority of legislators who actually are proposing such a motion, but how well does this resonate with the people in Texas?
I don't think it resonates as well as many people might expect. Texas is a unique culture And it's not uncommon for Texans to see themselves as Texans before they see themselves as Americans. But ultimately, Texas is also a very patriotic place. And the idea that a majority of Texans, let alone even a majority of Republicans who consider themselves to be really patriotic, would then decide to leave the United States is somewhat hard to conceive. This is really something that's only important and is going to be driven by an activated but very small share of voters, and really even a small share of Republican voters overall.
Now, before we end off, I have to ask, can they actually do it? Can Texas, then looking at the whole picture, can Texas actually secede from the United States?
They could try, but ultimately, history and reality dictate that it would most likely be nearly impossible to accomplish from a political standpoint. And then from a practical standpoint, it would be disastrous for the state, which is another reason why it would be very unlikely to see even legislators who flirt with the idea put their money where their mouth is and try to push a proposal through to the voters.
Now, we've seen in Texas things take a little bit of a shift to the right. Is this proposal part of that shift?
I think it's another example of the way in which activated minorities of Republican voters are really driving the state's agenda in a way that I think would surprise really a lot of average Texans. Ultimately, there's a lot of proposals in the Republican Party of Texas's platform, in addition to secession, that strike a lot of people as reactionary or retrograde or anachronistic for the period that we're living in. But ultimately, what we found in the last legislative session is that there's not really a lot that is restricting what Republican state leaders feel like they can accomplish. So even though I don't think it's very likely that Texas is going to secede from the United States in the near, medium, or long term, I do think it's unwise to consider this proposal is not another example of the state's rightward shift that we've been witnessing over the last few years.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Blank, for your time. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Back to you, Samana.
That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.